For years, Officer Ashley Parker wielded her badge like a shield, bullying her way through communities, stacking complaints that always vanished. Until the day her arrogance exploded in court. With a single slap, she struck a well-dressed black man, not knowing he was Judge Marcus Wilson. And in that instant, everything she'd built began to crumble. Phones captured the moment, headlines lit up, and the system she once manipulated turned its full gaze on her. They called it a slap, but really, it was the sound of a career detonating in public. Where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments. Also remember to like this video and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss interesting stories like this one. It happened in a flash. Nobody saw it coming. Not the guard, not the court reporter, not even the nervous defendants sitting in the front row. Officer Ashley Parker had just walked into courtroom 5A inside the Riverside County Courthouse in Arizona. Her uniform spotless, her jaw tight as always. Over the last 10 years, she'd made herself known as strict, serious, and someone you never wanted to cross. That morning, she'd been called to testify in a small drug case, but she never made it to the witness stand. She spotted a well-dressed black man standing near the witness box, quietly talking with one of the lawyers. Without hesitation, she stormed across the courtroom floor and slapped him hard across the face. The sound cracked through the room like a whip. A gasp followed, everyone at once. You could hear papers dropping, a pen rolling onto the floor. For a moment, time seemed frozen. Everyone sat still. The man didn't flinch. He didn't yell, didn't jump forward, didn't even raise a hand. He calmly fixed his tie, touched his cheek with the back of his hand, and looked her straight in the eye. "I'm Judge Marcus Wilson," he said, his voice calm and clear, "and I'm in charge of this courtroom today." That silence, it wasn't just shock anymore. It was heavy. Every pair of eyes locked on Ashley, who now looked like she'd swallowed rocks. She blinked once, twice, her mouth barely moving as if trying to find words. The guard, unsure what to do, shifted nervously by the door. The young public defender nearby instinctively reached for her phone, recording as subtly as she could. Others followed. Within seconds, at least 4 phones were capturing the moment. Ashley tried to speak. "I thought he wasn't supposed to be," but it was too late. Judge Wilson turned to the stunned courtroom and said, "We're taking a 10-minute break." And with that, he walked into his office, silent, his face unreadable. The room stayed still. No one knew whether to stand, sit, or leave. Ashley didn't move. Her hand, the one she'd used, trembled slightly at her side. The prosecutor leaned toward her and whispered, "You just attacked a judge." Ashley stared at him, pale and blinking fast, like someone had pulled the floor from under her. Words spread quickly. Reporters who'd been waiting for another case rushed into the hallway. 2 local news stations were tipped off by interns who'd left the room shaking. By noon, the clip had made its way onto social media. No context, no editing, just raw footage of a white cop in uniform striking a black judge in open court. The title under most shares was simple: "Cop slaps a judge, doesn't know he's a judge." At first, some people thought it had to be fake, staged maybe. But the video was too real, too chaotic in the small ways that real life always is. No background music, no fancy camera angles, just raw tension and real expressions. And then the reactions came: lawyers, activists, former defendants, all with their own stories. Some recognized Ashley immediately. Others knew her by reputation. Judge Wilson, meanwhile, stayed quiet. He didn't make public statements. He didn't go on television. He didn't threaten legal action. He just sat behind his desk, looking over the day's cases like nothing had happened. But everyone else knew something had shifted. The kind of shift you don't recover from. Before anyone could process what came next, people started asking a different question. Who was Officer Ashley Parker? Really? Before the slap, Most people outside of Riverside County had never heard the name Ashley Parker. But inside the police force, she wasn't just known, she was feared. Ashley rose through the ranks fast. Too fast, some said. Fresh out of training in her early 20s, she moved from patrol to narcotics to a special task force focused on high-risk neighborhoods. She earned medals, got featured in department newsletters, spoke at police conferences. But behind the headlines and staged handshakes was another version of Ashley. The one most people didn't see. It started small. A young black driver ticketed for a broken taillight swore he'd done nothing wrong. When he tried to explain, Ashley doubled his fine for non-compliance. He filed a complaint. It went nowhere. A Latina mother claimed Ashley searched her car without reason outside a grocery store. When her 10-year-old daughter asked why, Ashley told her, "You people should know better." The mother filed a report in tears. It disappeared within a week. Then came an incident that almost made the news. A video of Ashley cursing at two black teenagers sitting outside a convenience store. She accused them of loitering. One recorded her yelling, but the clip mysteriously vanished after the boys were arrested for resisting. There were whispers, too, in police locker rooms, among court clerks. Ashley used slurs when she thought no important people were listening. She threatened younger officers who didn't back her up in reports. Every time her name appeared in a complaint, Internal Affairs quietly marked it not sustained. She had friends in high places, Chief Reynolds among them. He called her a good cop in a hard world. To him, the public didn't understand what it took to deal with those neighborhoods. Colleagues like Officer Tom Jackson saw the warning signs early. He once tried to speak up after seeing Ashley slam a suspect's head against a police car window. "She told me if I filed anything, I'd find my locker cleaned out by Monday." So he backed off. They all did. Not because they agreed with her, but because Ashley was the system, not a problem in it. She wasn't an outsider. She was what it looked like when power met prejudice and wrapped itself in a badge. It wasn't just her actions. It was the arrogance that came with knowing she was untouchable. About 6 months before the courtroom incident, a new officer, Kyle Bennett, filed a formal complaint after working with her for 2 weeks. "I saw her stop 6 cars in a single day. All black drivers, all in the same 3-block area. Not one stop was justified," he wrote in the internal log. Bennett was moved to desk duty 2 weeks later. Ashley got an award. The problem wasn't just Ashley. It was that people let her succeed. Her rise through the department wasn't despite her behavior. It was because of it. But cracks were forming long before she struck Judge Wilson. Old complaints quietly resurfaced. Internal Affairs had new leadership. New city council members weren't as eager to cover things up. Still, Ashley didn't change. If anything, she doubled down. She called the changes political games and told colleagues at a department barbecue, "They can't touch me. I've got more dirt on half this department than they do on me." She didn't know it yet, but that wasn't power. That was a countdown, and it was already ticking. But when she struck that slap in court, on the wrong man in the worst possible place, that countdown hit 0. And the whole machine she'd relied on began to break down. When Judge Marcus Wilson stepped back into his office, he didn't slam the door. He didn't throw anything. He didn't yell. He simply sat down, took a breath, leaned forward, and reached for the stack of case files on his desk, like it was just another Tuesday. But it wasn't. Not for the dozens of people in that courtroom. Not for the lawyers who'd seen tension before, but never a uniformed officer slapping a judge, and certainly not for the man himself. Wilson had been a judge for 12 years, most of them in Riverside County. He wasn't flashy, didn't chase headlines, wore plain ties, kept photos of his wife and 3 sons on his bookshelf alongside a small gavel his youngest made in woodshop. But those who knew him understood one thing. His quiet presence carried weight. He'd grown up in Mesa, Arizona. First in his family to go to college, then law school. He worked as a public defender for 7 years before becoming a prosecutor. He'd seen every kind of case. The small ones, the tragic ones, the senseless ones. He treated them all with the same steady focus. What happened in that courtroom, that slap, it wasn't new to him. Disrespect had followed him most of his career. But this wasn't a dirty look or a dismissive tone. This was physical, public, undeniable. Yet he hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't thrown around his title. Because Wilson didn't believe in making scenes. He believed in consequences. In the hallway, his assistant Sarah Myers stood frozen, still holding the folder she'd meant to deliver before the incident. She stepped into his office hesitantly. "You okay?" she asked. He looked up calm. "I'm fine. Sit down." She sat, her eyes searching his face for any sign of anger. "I don't know what she thought she was doing," Sarah said. "We can file charges. Press charges. The footage is everywhere already." He nodded. "We could. But what? I want to see how they handle it." She tilted her head. "You mean the department? The whole system," he said, folding his hands. "Let's see if it's still allergic to accountability." Sarah blinked. She knew his style. That meant he wasn't going to push. He was going to wait and let them show their hand. By lunchtime, Judge Wilson's name was trending. People recognized him from a graduation speech he gave at a local high school 2 years earlier. Clips resurfaced. Quotes were posted. "The law isn't a weapon. It's a tool, and it belongs to everyone, not just the loudest voices." But he didn't tweet, didn't give a statement. When asked by reporters at the end of the day if he planned to press charges, he gave only this: "I expect the same level of professionalism and accountability I've shown others for the past 12 years. I trust the system to handle this properly." It was a challenge masked as calm, and people picked up on it. Meanwhile, inside the department, things were already getting uncomfortable. The chief's assistant had left 3 messages on Ashley's voicemail. Legal counsel for the county sent a quiet message to HR. At least 2 junior officers had called in sick, not wanting to be pulled into the growing storm. Still, Wilson didn't push, because he didn't have to. The footage spoke louder than anything he could say. At home that night, his wife Denise sat beside him on the couch, holding his hand. "You should have let them take her out in handcuffs," she said quietly. "I wanted to," he admitted. "But you didn't. Because it wouldn't fix anything." She sighed. "You think this time will be different?" He looked down at their interlocked fingers. "I think this time she picked the wrong man in the wrong place at the exact right moment." But if Ashley thought silence meant giving up, she was about to learn just how loud dignity could become when the country was finally watching. By the next morning, Ashley Parker was on administrative leave. The official email from the department was vague. Pending investigation into an incident involving court personnel. But the truth didn't need a press release. It was already everywhere. The slap had gone viral overnight. News anchors played it on loop. Podcasts broke it down. Comment sections exploded with stories from people who claimed they'd had their own run-ins with her. One video surfaced from 4 years earlier. Grainy dashcam footage of Ashley yelling at a teenage boy during a traffic stop, her words slightly slurred, her tone threatening. The boy had been released without charges, but the recording never saw daylight until now. This time, people weren't just talking. They were listening. And her badge wasn't protecting her anymore. Inside the department, it was chaos. Officers whispered in hallways. Her closest allies, the same ones who used to joke with her at Friday briefings, suddenly had other things to do when she walked by. A memo from Internal Affairs went around asking for interviews with anyone who had worked with Officer Parker. Over a dozen officers responded within 24 hours. Not all gave their names. One of them, Detective Rachel Ortiz, had waited nearly 6 years to say what she knew. She threatened me in the locker room once, Rachel told investigators. Said if I ever questioned her reports again, I'd find myself working the county jail rotation. Another, a former trainee now working patrol, described a time when Ashley planted a flashlight under a suspect's seat just to justify a search. She called it insurance, he said. Said no one would ever check her footage. The floodgates were open now. It was no longer just about the slap. That was the spark. What followed was years of smoke finally catching fire. Internal Affairs began pulling her old reports, comparing them. Patterns emerged. Too many stops of minorities, vague reasons for searches, repeated complaints. Meanwhile, Ashley tried to control the story. She reached out to a local conservative talk show host, gave a shaky phone interview claiming the judge had looked threatening, and made a sudden move. It didn't work. Even her usual defenders paused. You could almost hear her support crumbling when the host cut the segment short, saying, "We'll wait for more facts before jumping to conclusions." Then came the email from her union lawyer. "Due to a conflict of interest, I can no longer represent you in this matter." Translation: "You're toxic." Her inbox filled up. Reporters called. Friends stopped answering. Even her daughter, 19-year-old Emma, a college freshman, left a single text. "Why would you do that, Mom?" Ashley sat in her kitchen. The once proud medals from her service displayed above the fridge looked different now. Heavier, like they didn't belong to her anymore. She still believed she hadn't done anything wrong. Not really. "He looked like a criminal," she muttered alone at her kitchen table. "He shouldn't have been standing there dressed like that, talking like he ran the place." But deep down, she knew this wasn't about what Judge Wilson wore or where he stood. It was about her reflex, the one she never questioned, the one that had gotten her promotions, respect, and fear, but never accountability. And now that reflex had turned into a wrecking ball. 2 days after the incident, the Riverside County Police Department held a press conference. For the first time in 15 years, the chief was joined by legal counsel. "We do not support Officer Parker's actions in the courtroom. An internal investigation is ongoing. We take this matter very seriously." He didn't call her a good cop. He didn't say she'd served with honor. He didn't say anything that sounded like protection. Just facts, cold and distant. Ashley watched the press conference on her living room TV, the same way everyone else did. But if she thought the silence from her colleagues was the worst of it, she was about to find out what happens when the entire structure she leaned on starts pulling away, one brick at a time. Ashley used to walk through the department like she owned it. Not anymore. The few who still made eye contact did so quickly, nervously, like they didn't want to be seen near her. Her once iron grip on the precinct was gone. In its place was an awkward emptiness, like someone had taken down a crooked picture, but the nail was still stuck in the wall. The leave dragged on. No paycheck, no badge, no answers. Just waiting at home. Her world was shrinking fast. Her daughter Emma hadn't returned any texts since the night of the incident. They'd never been close. Not really. Ashley had raised her with rules, not warmth. But now the silence hurt in a different way. She tried calling once more. "This is your mom. Please just talk to me." The line went dead after the first ring. Ashley stared at her phone for a long time before placing it face down. She'd spent so long thinking she was in control, that people's fear meant respect, that those complaints were just noise from people who didn't understand the job. But now, sitting at her kitchen table, blinds half closed to avoid the news van across the street, all she had was time and silence. She hadn't been charged yet, but the department wasn't protecting her anymore. The union had gone quiet. The lawyers stopped replying. And in the background, more accusations piled up. A civil rights group filed a request for an independent review of every case she'd touched in the last 5 years. One by one, names came forward: former suspects, former officers, even a retired judge who remembered Ashley screaming at a defendant during trial, something he'd ignored at the time as stress. She went online to read the comments, just to see. Parker is exactly why we need reform. This woman thought she was above the law. She messed with the wrong judge, thank God. And then the worst ones, from people who claimed to be her friends. I always had a weird feeling about her. She was always too aggressive. I remember once she laughed after making a kid cry in an interrogation room. That stuck with me. It wasn't betrayal. It was erasure. Like she'd never belonged to them at all. Her voicemail was full. Reporters, civil attorneys. Even one woman from a documentary company asking if Ashley would share her side of the story. She didn't return the call. The only place she felt somewhat safe was her garage, sitting in the car, engine off, doors locked. She'd spend hours in there, going through old cases in her head, telling herself none of this would be happening if that judge had just stepped aside, if he hadn't been trying to make a scene. But no matter how many ways she twisted it, she couldn't change what happened. She slapped a man in open court. A man who wasn't a threat, who wasn't a suspect, who was a sitting judge. And the whole country saw it. One afternoon, her neighbor Mrs. Coleman, who used to wave at her during morning jogs, walked past with her dog and didn't even look in Ashley's direction. That tiny moment hit harder than she expected. The quiet cutting off, the polite rejection. It felt worse than the headlines, because headlines fade, but being left behind, that sticks. Later that night, Ashley scrolled through an old department photo on her phone. A group of them standing in front of the building sign. She zoomed in on herself, sunglasses, smirking, hand on her hip. She thought she looked powerful then. Now all she saw was arrogance. But just when she thought her fall had reached the bottom, a letter arrived, calling her to a public hearing that would bring everything into the open and force her to face the one man who never raised his voice, but had already torn down her legacy. The public hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning at 9:30 a.m. inside the Riverside Municipal Assembly Hall. The location alone was enough to signal this wasn't going to be a quiet, private review. This was going to be seen. By the time Ashley arrived, wearing a plain black suit, no badge, no weapon, the room was already 3/4 full. Journalists lined the back wall, audio gear clipped to their belts. Rows of folding chairs groaned under the weight of residents, activists, and legal observers. In the second row, behind a line of junior prosecutors, sat Judge Marcus Wilson. No robe, just a dark gray suit, calm eyes, and a legal pad resting on his knee. He didn't look angry. He didn't look satisfied either. He looked like someone who had shown up for work, like he was there to witness, not to get revenge. Ashley's lawyer, a new one, a young public defender who'd taken her case reluctantly, stood beside her, whispering instructions she didn't really hear. Across from them, the Civilian Review Board sat in a long arc of plastic nameplates and stern expressions. A retired detective, a former public defender, a local pastor, a community organizer, a judge from another county. This wasn't a courtroom, but it might as well have been. The chairwoman, Mrs. Helen Carter, began the session promptly. She had a voice that cut through the noise like a knife. This hearing is not a trial. It is a public examination of Officer Ashley Parker's conduct, both recent and past, as it relates to her ability to continue serving in law enforcement. Ashley flinched at the phrase, continue serving. Like that door was still open, like this wasn't a funeral for her career. They began with the courtroom footage, played on a small screen that barely captured the weight of the moment, but left no room for denial. The sound echoed faintly in the hall. The slap, the silence, Judge Wilson's calm voice. Then came testimony. Officer Rachel Ortiz read her prepared statement about the threat Ashley made 6 years ago. Her voice was steady but cold. Next, two former arrestees stepped forward, both describing how Ashley's name showed up in their paperwork despite her not being at the scene. She'd signed off on their arrests without explanation. One witness after another, all while Ashley sat motionless, eyes locked ahead, refusing to show reaction. Then, near the end of the session, the chairwoman called Judge Wilson to the microphone. He didn't bring his legal pad. He didn't bring notes. Just stood, buttoned his jacket and spoke. "I won't waste this board's time going over what we all saw. That's already public record," he began. "What I want to address is what comes after accountability, because that's where the real work begins." He paused. A few pens scratched against paper. "I've served this county for over a decade. I've seen people do reckless things out of fear. I've seen people lash out because they felt small. But what happened that day in my courtroom wasn't fear. It wasn't a mistake. It was a reflex born from years of unchecked power." He turned slightly, just enough to meet Ashley's eyes. "I'm not here to ruin someone's life. I'm here to remind this community what justice is supposed to look like, and what it should never look like again." Then he sat. No applause. No nods. Just silence. Ashley's lawyer made a few final statements, mostly procedure, mostly begging for mercy. It didn't matter. The board took a brief break before giving their recommendation. Officer Ashley Parker was to be permanently removed from duty, all benefits taken away, and her conduct sent to the state attorney for further review. She stood there, blank, as the room emptied. People weren't looking at her the way they used to. Not with fear or even hatred. Just indifference. That might have hurt more than anything. Judge Wilson walked past her on his way out. He didn't stop. He didn't look back. Because some people don't need revenge. The truth did the work for them. But long after the cameras stopped flashing, the question remained. What lesson would the community carry forward from the silence that finally made the system listen? Weeks passed. The headlines quieted. Other scandals took the spotlight. But in Riverside County, something had shifted for real this time. Not just in whispers, not behind closed doors, but in how people looked at the system, in how they looked at each other. The courtroom where it happened stayed busy. Cases came and went, just like always. But when Judge Marcus Wilson walked in, the room stood up with a different kind of respect. Not just for his title, but for the way he'd handled it all. He never once demanded attention, never asked for praise. He just kept doing the work. One afternoon, after a juvenile hearing, a young public defender stopped him in the hallway. "Can I ask you something, Judge?" she said, glancing around. "That day, how did you stay calm?" He took a second. I didn't want to give her what she expected. Then he smiled gently, nodded once, and walked on. That answer stuck with her, and it echoed through the courthouse in other ways. Officers started sitting through updated bias training that wasn't just for show. A community board was given real power, more than a nameplate and a folding table. Old case files were reviewed. Not all of them, but some. Enough to let people know the doors were opening. As for Ashley Parker, she faded. She sold her house quietly and moved 3 counties over. No interviews, no public statements. She took a job in private security for a shipping company. Her name stopped appearing in the papers, except as a footnote in opinion pieces. There was no comeback, no redemption story. She didn't lose everything overnight. But what she lost was the only thing that ever mattered to her: control. And in its place was a silence she couldn't fight. At the same time, more people came forward, victims of other officers, other moments, all encouraged by what they saw in that courtroom. They weren't asking for revenge. They were asking to be heard. That was the power of it. The moment Ashley's hand cracked across Judge Wilson's face, it wasn't just about that one act. It was the public end of a private pattern. And people knew it. In a place like Riverside County, where things usually moved slow and quiet. That kind of exposure did more than shake the department. It changed the habits of a whole community. At a town meeting 2 months later, a woman stood up, older, glasses sliding down her nose, voice steady. "I don't want another apology. I want policies," she said. "I want change that doesn't wait for the next viral video." The room nodded because they knew what she meant. Because this time, they had seen what happens when someone thinks their badge shields them from consequences, and the truth walks into the room wearing a suit and saying, "I'm the judge today." This wasn't a Hollywood story. There were no last-minute breakdowns, no dramatic confessions. Just the long, slow process of someone falling from a position they built themselves, and the even slower work of others building something better in its place. The walls of that courtroom would never forget what happened inside them. The slap might fade, the cameras might move on, but the lesson stayed. Power unchecked becomes poison. Silence can be louder than shouting, and real justice doesn't need to raise its voice to be heard. So what do we take from all this? Maybe it's that character always shows itself when you think no one's watching, when you feel untouchable, or when the mask slips in a moment you can't take back. Ashley built an empire on fear. Judge Wilson built his presence on restraint. Only one of them still has a seat in the room. And in the end, that's what justice looks like. If this story made you think, made you feel, or just made you pause, subscribe to the channel. We tell the stories that others are too afraid to touch, with truth at the center.